On the 17th of August, 1934, at the World's Fair in Chicago, the richest industrialist in America sat 30 reporters down to lunch and served them a meal in which every single dish was made from the same bean. Celery stuffed with a cheese made from it, soup, salad, croquettes instead of a roast, bread, cocoa made with its milk, coffee brewed from it, ice cream churned from it. 14 dishes and not one scrap of meat on the table. And at the end of it, Henry Ford stood up and told the press that the future of American agriculture was on the plate in front of them. He was not being eccentric for the sake of it. He was already the largest grower of this bean in the entire Western world. He had a laboratory full of chemists working on nothing else. By 1938, he was appearing at meetings in a suit woven from its fiber, which had reportedly cost him a fortune in research to make. And in 1941, he unveiled a car with body panels made from a plastic derived from it. When people suggested it was a gimmick, a man swung an axe at the boot lid in front of the cameras, and it did not dent. Here is the part that should stop you. The axe had a rubber boot on the blade. Ford was not simply a believer, he was selling. He wanted to convince a country that you could grow an automobile out of the ground, and he was willing to stack the demonstration to do it. And he was laughed at, and he was wrong about almost every specific thing he predicted. No car company grows its bodywork. Nobody is wearing a soybean suit. He was also, in the only way that ever mattered, completely right. This bean did go on to remake the industrial world. It simply did not do it by becoming a car. It did it by becoming meat. But soy's story does not begin at a World's Fair. It begins about 5,000 years earlier in a field in northern China with a plant so unremarkable that nobody would look at it twice. This is the history of soy. Our story starts in the north of China, where a farmer is standing over a low, scrubby, fuzzy-podded plant. It is not a grain. It does not make bread. It is not sweet. It grows close to the ground and it looks like nothing at all. But farmers there had noticed something odd about it without having any means of explaining it. If you grow this plant in a field, the field afterwards is better. Not exhausted, better. Every other crop is a withdrawal from the soil. This one is a deposit. Pull one up and look at the roots and you will see why. There are lumps on them, small pink nodules like beads. Inside those nodules, the plant is housing bacteria. It builds them a chamber, feeds them sugar, and in exchange, those bacteria perform a trick almost nothing else alive can do. They reach up into the air, take nitrogen straight out of it, and hand it to the plant in a form the plant can use. Nitrogen is the bottleneck of all life. It is the limiting ingredient in protein, and protein is what a body is built out of. Nearly every crop on Earth has to scavenge its nitrogen from the dirt, which is why we exhaust land and why we invented fertilizer, and why we now burn enormous quantities of fossil fuel making it. The soybean does not have that problem. The soybean makes its own, and that is why it is loaded. A dried soybean is somewhere around 40% protein by weight, which is a freakish number. Wheat is nowhere near it. Rice is nowhere near it. Nothing you can grow at scale on this planet packs protein like this. China knew what it had. Soy sits in the ancient Chinese lists of the 5 grains, the handful of crops considered the foundation of the whole civilization, alongside rice and millet. Farmers there worked it into rotations for thousands of years, understanding perfectly well that it restored a tired field and having absolutely no idea that the reason was a colony of bacteria living in a lump on a root. Which brings us to the catch, and it is a serious one. You cannot eat it, not raw. A raw soybean contains compounds that actively block the enzyme in your gut that digests protein, which is a spectacular joke. The plant has packed itself with the finest protein in agriculture and then made it very difficult for an animal to get at any of it. So the Chinese did something remarkable. They did not eat the bean. They took it apart. They boiled it, ground it, strained it, and made a milk. They curdled that milk with mineral salts and pressed the curds into blocks, and that is tofu. They took the whole bean, put a mold on it, buried it in salt, and let it break down for months into a dark, savory paste, and that is miso, and that is jian. They pressed the liquid off it, and that is soy sauce. In Japan, they fermented it with a bacterium until it went stringy and pungent, and that is natto. In Indonesia, they bound it into a cake with a fungus, and that is tempeh. In Korea, it became the base of gochujang and doenjang. Every one of those is the same idea. Use a microbe, or a salt, or a curdling agent to do the digesting for you outside your body before the food ever reaches your mouth. Which means that soy, the thing sold today as simple and natural and ancient, is one of the most heavily processed foods in human history, and it has been for 2,000 years. That was never a flaw. That was the entire technology. There is a story about how tofu was invented. Legend says a Han prince, an alchemist obsessed with finding an elixir of immortality, was experimenting with ground soybeans and accidentally curdled the liquid with a mineral salt and produced a soft white block instead of eternal life. It is a lovely story. The hard evidence for tofu turns up a very long time after that prince was in the ground. Enjoy the legend. Do not build anything on it. For thousands of years, that was the arrangement. Soy stayed in East Asia. It fed hundreds of millions of people as tofu and sauce and paste. It quietly rebuilt the soil between other crops, and the rest of the world barely knew it existed. Europe met it, but only at the very end of the pipe. Dutch and Portuguese traders brought soy sauce back from Japan in the 1600s, and it arrived as an exotic, expensive, dark condiment for the wealthy. It reached England. It ended up as an ingredient in a famous British bottled sauce that is still on supermarket shelves today and still has fermented soy in it. But nobody in Europe grew the bean because nobody in Europe had the faintest idea what to do with it. It arrived, in other words, as a flavor. Europe met soy as a bottle of something dark to shake onto meat, and for 200 years that was the whole of the relationship. Nobody planted it. Nobody knew what a soybean looked like. The first time soy went global, it did not go as food at all. It went as cargo. At the start of the 20th century, the plains of Manchuria were producing soybeans in enormous quantity, and armies and railways were being built across that ground by empires who wanted it. When Europe hit a shortage of vegetable oil, British buyers turned to Manchuria, and from around 1908, ships full of soybeans began arriving in Liverpool. Not to be eaten, to be crushed. For a few decades, Manchuria was the soybean capital of the world. Then came invasion, and a world war, and a revolution, and that trade broke apart. The world needed a new supplier, and the United States had been quietly preparing for exactly that without really knowing it. Because between 1929 and 1931, two men from the United States Department of Agriculture spent 2 years traveling through Japan, Korea, and northeastern China, going village to village, farm to farm, buying and begging and collecting soybean seeds. They shipped home thousands of distinct varieties bred over millennia by farmers whose names nobody ever wrote down. That collection is the genetic foundation of practically every soybean grown in the Western Hemisphere today. The entire American soybean industry stands on a suitcase of seeds that Asian farmers handed over, mostly for nothing, to two polite strangers with notebooks, which is where Henry Ford comes back in. Ford was the patron of a movement that called itself Chemurgy, which is the idea that a farm should feed a factory as easily as it feeds a family, and that the answer to a country drowning in crop surpluses is to find industrial uses for them. Soy was the prize exhibit. By the mid-30s, a bushel of soybeans was going into the paint, the horn button, the gear shift knob, the accelerator pedal, and the timing gears of every car Ford built. George Washington Carver, working down at Tuskegee, shared the same conviction and became Ford's friend, and Ford eventually named a laboratory after him. None of it worked in the end. Plastics came from oil instead. But Ford had done something he never intended. He had spent a decade telling American farmers at meeting after meeting that they should be planting soybeans, and they listened. American soybean acreage began climbing before the war, and it never really stopped. The single largest crop transformation in American agricultural history was set in motion in part by a car manufacturer with a hobby. Then the planes blew away in the Dust Bowl, and a crop that repairs soil instead of stripping it suddenly looked like a national asset. Then the Second World War arrived, and a country at war needs fat and needs protein and needs almost everything. Soybean oil went into food to replace rationed fats and into industry, and the glycerine that comes off it went into explosives. The government told farmers to plant soy as a patriotic duty. American acreage multiplied several times over inside a decade. And now here is the part of this story that most people never learn. When you crush a soybean, you get two things. You get oil. Roughly a fifth of the bean comes out as a light, cheap, neutral vegetable oil, and industry wanted that badly. It went into soap, paint, varnish, linoleum, explosives, and above all into food, as margarine and shortening, because animal fat was expensive and this was not. And you get the other 80%, a dry, dull, protein-rich cake. The meal. Nobody wanted the meal. Sit with that. The most protein-dense crop in the history of agriculture, and to the industry crushing it, the protein was garbage. It was what was left in the machine after you had taken out the thing you actually came for. Crushers had warehouses of it. They fed a bit to cattle without much enthusiasm. They plowed some back into fields. It was a disposal problem. And then somebody looked at the mountain of leftovers and asked a question. What if we fed it to a chicken? Because here is a thing about a chicken. A chicken is a machine for turning protein into protein, and it is very good at it, and the limiting factor is the quality of the protein going in. Feed a bird corn alone and it grows slowly, because corn is energy without enough of the right building blocks. Feed it corn plus soybean meal, and the amino acids in the soy fill in almost precisely the gaps that corn leaves. Corn and soy together are close to a complete diet for a bird. It is a nutritional coincidence. Two plants from opposite sides of the planet, one from Mexico and one from China, that happen to fit together like a lock and a key inside the body of a bird from Southeast Asia. Nobody designed that, and it became one of the most consequential accidents of the 20th century. The chicken changed. Before this, a chicken was mostly a machine for producing eggs, and you ate the meat when she stopped laying. And it was tough, and it was a Sunday thing, and it was not cheap. Within about 30 years, the broiler chicken became an industrial product, bred for growth, housed indoors by the tens of thousands, fed corn and soy, slaughtered in weeks. Chicken went from a luxury to the cheapest meat on the planet. Pork followed, farmed fish followed, and every bit of it runs on the leftover, the waste product, the thing they used to have trouble getting rid of. There was one other door the bean came through, and it explains the aisle in your supermarket. Soy entered the American diet through religion in the vegetarian kitchens of a Protestant church that had been building meat substitutes since the 19th century, in the same sanatoriums and health institutes that gave America breakfast cereal. And it came through a second time in the 1970s when the counterculture discovered tofu and treated it as a moral position. Soy milk, veggie burgers, the whole shelf. It is real and it feeds a lot of people, but keep the scale straight in your head. Compared to what this bean is actually doing in the world, that entire shelf is a rounding error, which brings us to the strangest chapter in the whole story, and it begins, of all places, with a fish. In the winter of 1972, off the coast of Peru, the anchovy fishery collapsed. A warm current moved in and the fish were gone. That mattered far beyond Peru because ground anchovy was, at that moment, one of the main protein inputs in animal feed worldwide. The world needed to replace that protein. It ran to soybeans, and the price of soybeans went vertical. Now put yourself in the White House in 1973. Richard Nixon is fighting inflation, food prices are the political story of the year, and Watergate is closing in around him. On the 27th of June, his administration announced an export embargo on soybeans. American beans would stay in America. Prices at home would come down. It worked, briefly, and it was one of the most expensive decisions in the history of American agriculture. Because Japan bought roughly 90% of all its soybeans from the United States. 90% from one country of a food eaten at every meal. And Japan does not run on soybean meal. Japan runs on soy the old way. Tofu, miso, soy sauce 3 times a day in every household in the country. The embargo did not threaten Japanese livestock. It threatened Japanese dinner. The Japanese press called it the soy sauce shock. And the lesson the Japanese government drew from it was permanent. Never again depend on a single supplier for a staple food. The embargo was lifted within months. Japan had already started moving. It went to Brazil. Specifically, it went to the Cerrado, an enormous inland savanna of acidic red soil that everybody had written off as impossible to farm. Japan put money and agronomists into a joint program with Brazilian researchers, and they ran it for the better part of 20 years. They corrected the soil with lime, they bred soybeans for the tropics, they built the roads, and the Cerrado opened. In 1977, Brazil planted around 19 million acres of soybeans. Today, it plants well over 100 million. It has overtaken the United States. It is now the largest soybean exporter on Earth, and most of that crop comes out of ground that Japanese money helped make farmable. America closed the door for a few months to protect its own dinner table. In doing so, it handed the century to somebody else, which brings us, at last, to now. The world grows something in the region of 400 million tons of soybeans a year. Almost all of it is genetically modified. In 1996, a soybean went on sale that had been engineered to survive being sprayed with a herbicide that kills everything else in the field. And that single change is what made farming on this scale possible, because it removed the labor. You no longer had to weed, you sprayed. One person could now run a farm the size of a town, and roughly 3/4 of the crop, by most estimates, is eaten by animals. Not by you. By chickens and pigs and farmed salmon and dairy cattle in sheds and pens all over the world. Most of the rest is crushed for oil. The share of the global soybean harvest that a human being eats directly, as tofu or milk or edamame or sauce, is small. One country buys most of what crosses an ocean. China, having spent 5,000 years eating soy as tofu and sauce, spent the last 30 years getting rich and deciding it wanted pork. It now imports soybeans in volumes with no precedent in history and feeds them to the largest pig herd in the world. The soybean, a Chinese plant domesticated by Chinese farmers, is now shipped back to China in bulk carriers, from land that was savanna in living memory to fatten Chinese animals. And that dependence cuts both ways, which the world discovered again in 2018. When the United States opened a trade war, China reached for the most painful thing it could find, and what it found was the soybean. It put heavy tariffs on American beans, and American soybean exports to China fell off a cliff, and the American government ended up paying its own farmers billions of dollars to survive a market it had helped destroy. And China simply bought from Brazil instead. Some of that trade never came back. For the second time in 50 years, a soybean policy written in Washington handed Brazil a permanent gift. So go and check your assumptions. If you have never eaten tofu in your life, you may believe that soy is not part of your diet. You ate soy today. You ate it in the chicken, You ate it in the bacon, and in the egg, and in the milk, and in the farmed fish, and in the oil the chips were fried in, and in the lecithin that stops the chocolate bar from separating. You are not a soy eater. You are a soy eater with one animal standing in between, and the animal is there to make the soy invisible. Which makes one modern anxiety about this bean quietly hilarious. You will have heard that soy is dangerous for men because it contains compounds that resemble estrogen. Those compounds are real, but when researchers have looked at actual populations of men who eat soy, including men in countries that have eaten it daily for 2,000 years, the effect people are afraid of does not turn up. And the man refusing tofu on those grounds is eating a chicken that was raised on soybean meal and has been all his life and has no idea. And there is a bill. Soy needs land, and there is no spare land, so it takes land. In Brazil, it moved into the Cerrado, one of the most biodiverse savannas on Earth, and consumed enormous stretches of it. It pushed on the Amazon hard enough that in 2006, the traders signed an agreement not to buy soy from newly cleared Amazon rainforest. That slowed the clearing in the Amazon. It did not stop the clearing, it moved it. The bulldozers went next door into the savanna that nobody had written a campaign about. There is a straight line here, and it is worth saying plainly. It runs from a warm current in the Pacific in 1972 to a cornered president in 1973 to a Japanese ministry deciding it would never be caught out again, to lime being spread on red soil in central Brazil, to a bulldozer in the Cerrado this morning, to the price of the chicken in your sandwich this afternoon. So think back for a moment on the whole journey. A low, fuzzy, unremarkable plant in a field in northern China, and a farmer who has noticed only that the dirt is better afterwards and will never know why. A bean nobody can eat raw, taken apart instead by mold and salt and thyme into tofu and miso and sauce. Ships full of Manchurian beans arriving in Liverpool to be crushed for their oil. Two men from the Department of Agriculture walking village to village with notebooks. Henry Ford in a soybean suit swinging a rubber-booted axe at a car. The most protein-dense crop in history sitting in a warehouse treated as garbage. A chicken fed on the garbage and meat made cheap for the first time in the history of our species. An anchovy harvest failing off Peru, and a president closing a door, and a savanna in Brazil being cleared because of it. And finally, 400 million tons a year, 3/4 of it eaten by animals so that you can eat the animals. It is one of the most extraordinary stories any single plant has ever written across human history. And the strangest part of all is how ordinary it feels now, because it does not feel like anything at all. Soy is the one commodity that has succeeded by disappearing. Nobody advertises it to you. It is waiting for you tonight, not in a labeled packet, but in the fridge, inside the chicken, and in the cupboard, 3/4 of the way down an ingredients list under a name you would not recognize. You will eat it without a second thought, which is exactly what it was engineered to do. But now you know what you are really holding. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind the everyday things all around you. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which part of soy's story surprised you the most. There is a lot more history waiting to be pressed.